What if I told you that God is speaking to you all the time, but maybe you're missing his voice? You might be praying or journaling or going to mass 3 times a week, church, part of a small group, and you're listening to sermons, but you just don't hear his voice. In this video, I'm going to share with you 3 of the most common reasons why Christians can't hear his voice, and then practices to help shift and notice God's voice in your life. I just want to remind you that even if you can't hear God's voice, the fact that you, 1, clicked on this video, 2, that you desire to hear from him means you actually are hearing from him and you're not failing. God sees that desire, and that desire is so good. And my hope is that what you take away from this video is a renewed sense of hope that you can hear his voice, that God is speaking to you, and that you actually have the tools to be able to learn to listen to God. Because ultimately it is an art, it's not a science. One of the biggest shifts that I had to learn when I was coming to notice how God was speaking in my own life, it wasn't A plus B equals C, it was more nuanced than that. After sitting with hundreds of Christians, these are the 3 most common things that I see that keep people from hearing God's voice. And they're actually just ways of relating to God. They're not sins or anything like that, which is surprising, right? Because we're kind of told that, oh, it's because of your sin, or you're messing up, or you're not praying hard enough, you're not disciplined enough. It's really not about discipline. It's really more about the orientation of our hearts and how our spiritual ears are trained to hear God. The first one is that our expectations of how to hear God are way too narrow, or they are stuck replaying old ways of hearing from God that have now shifted and we're not up to date. It's kind of like having a computer that is running on an old software, and now new applications won't work on this old version of the computer. And so what we have to do is update our computer or our way of listening so that we can now run with the new programming of God wanting to speak to us. I hope that analogy makes sense. Oftentimes we're expecting, when we hear God and feel this amazing feeling inside, or to have this incredible peace, or to get this neon sign in the sky. But oftentimes God comes to us in small, subtle ways that if we aren't trained to look for those ways, we'll miss him completely. Or we've expected God to repeat the same way he's spoken to us in the past. Say last week, God spoke to you clearly through a friend talking. We're now going to look for God in our friendships versus looking for God in other ways. I grew up in a Christian home, and when I would read the Bible growing up, it never really connected with me. But when I was in college, I had a pretty traumatic experience, and it reoriented me to take my faith very seriously. And I would read the scriptures as if it was my very breath, as if I was so thirsty. I was just taking everything in, and I felt like I was hearing from God all the time through his word, and it was aligning with my life and what exactly I needed to do. But then I would continue to come back to the scripture, and then things started to shift. I didn't feel close to God. I didn't hear from him for my actual life. And so I started to think something's wrong with me. God doesn't want to speak to me. And so I started creating this narrative around, well, God doesn't talk to me, or I'm not good enough. It was my old narcissistic tendencies. And it wasn't until I realized that I had these expectations of God was going to speak to me in the exact same way he did when I was going through this traumatic experience. God had actually shifted how he was talking to me, and I didn't know how to notice those signs because I was expecting him to repeat the same exact way. I was using God in the Bible as a vending machine. If I insert a coin, I'm supposed to get a sticker back or a gumball. Instead, how might God be speaking in my life versus why aren't you speaking to me? The second reason why people can't hear his voice often is because in our society, at least in the Western culture where I live, we thrive on systems. We want to have formulas for things, 5 steps, a blueprint. We want to know exactly what to do. And we approach hearing from God like it's a science, like there are 5 steps. And if we just do the steps in sequential order, that we're going to get the results. Like it's like a recipe. If we want to bake the best blueberry cake. We will want to know how much flour goes into it, how many eggs, how much sugar, how much water, or whatever you put in the cake. But when we approach our relationship like it's a formula, like it's a science, we're going to get a muddled, jumbled up experience of prayer because we're not actually going to hear God's voice because there's no steps to it. God is a personal being. He's not a science project. When we relate to God with these formulaic or very mechanical ways of listening to God, we won't hear his voice because we're looking for a rigid plan versus a relational experience from God. Oftentimes, God doesn't speak in audible ways. He speaks in so many other ways. Hit the subscribe button because in a few weeks, I'm going to come out with a video on 10 ways that God speaks to us clearly and 10 subtle ways that he speaks to us. And if you're watching this later, the videos are probably already out, so continue to find them on my channel. But if we try to manufacture hearing from God, we can miss him entirely. Some of the questions that I like to ask myself when I find myself, and I still do this, find myself trying to relate to God in a formula, because I love formulas. That's great. It's really clear and it feels good and safe and contained. One of the questions I like to ask is just to journal. What are some of the formulas that I've learned to hear God's voice? You might have learned acts. What is it? Appreciation, confession, thanksgiving, and supplication. That's one formula of prayer. There's nothing wrong with formulas to some degree. I use the prayer of examine. I use 5 steps sometimes when it comes to prayer, but they're open-ended containers versus you have to do these things and therefore you're going to get this result. If you follow this recipe, you're going to get an amazing moist cake that is going to impress all of your friends. So the questions I like to ask are, what are the formulas that I have projected onto God in my prayer life? And then 2, what are the signs that I'm looking for God to speak to me? And then you can just notice, are these signs helpful or are they not? And leave space for God to speak, to show you how you might be approaching prayer in a way that is formulaic versus relational. Even if we're not chasing a formula, we may just have so much internal and external noise that even if we are open to God speaking to us through art or through music or through any other way besides an audible voice or a formula, we might just have so much noise that we can't actually hear God. And that is the third most common reason why we can't hear God's voice, is because we are just in environments and we are consuming so much content. We have so many internal voices and external voices in our sphere that it drowns out hearing from God. We avoid silence, we avoid quiet, and we are constantly overstimulated. And that creates a lot of stress in our nervous system, and therefore we can't hear God because we can barely even hear our own thoughts and our own desires. So if you've been consuming a lot of Christian content, if you're reading a lot of books, and I love reading books, I love learning, I love watching YouTube videos, but there needs to be a space where we turn them off and we lower our expectations, or really our demands, because expectations are disguised demands. We lower our expectations of ourselves trying to hear from God or God to say something, and we just let whatever's happening in our life be there. We need to learn to be still. When we approach hearing from God or our Bible reading or any other spiritual practice, when we approach it like something to accomplish, we will push out God. We will push out even our own self in the process. Questions I like to ask myself when I feel overly distracted is, number 1 is my environment really noisy? Could I turn off the music in my car? You could turn off your phone after 7 p.m. You could take a Sabbath, take a social media detox is one of my favorite ways of doing this. Half a Sunday and turn off your phone. You can spend 5 minutes in prayer just in silence, not talking to God, not expecting anything, just practicing sitting in silence. If you notice that it's uncomfortable, after the time of silence, write down, this was uncomfortable. I didn't like it. What do you think happened in there? Where was God? Was he maybe saying something? We start to notice what happens when we don't have any noise. We might find that our soul is so busy and cluttered that even if God did speak, even if he spoke loudly and clearly, we may not actually hear him. It could be because we have some trauma we need to unpack. It could be because we are feeling a lot of fear. I oftentimes find that when we are overly consuming content, it's because there's a deficit or there's some pain in our hearts that we are avoiding, that we're not feeling. So maybe ask yourself, am I resisting feeling something? And that is a great place to start your prayer life with is, Lord, what's going on in my soul? What are you doing in my life? And how can I cooperate with that? One experiment that I want to leave you with is I like to look at how God might have been speaking to me in this past week. Oftentimes it's easier to look in the rearview mirror about what God has done in our lives versus trying to capture it in the moment. The more we look back, the more actually we'll be attuned to seeing God in the present moment. So I want you to get out a piece of paper and write down this last week 15 ways God might have spoken to you. That doesn't mean he has or hasn't. I'm not trying to have you like write this in like embossed ink or put it on the wall. It's just to start brain dumping all the ways in which God might have spoken to you. List out 15 ways. And if a voice comes up in your head like, oh, God probably didn't speak that way, you're crazy, just silence that voice and say, thank you for trying to correct me. I'm not building a theology on this list. I'm just exploring with God. And then after you have the 15 ways, pause and ask the Spirit, Lord, where were you speaking to me in all of these things? And just circle 2 or 3. And then pray with the Lord. Pray and just say, Lord, what were you saying? If you were speaking, what were you saying in those areas or in those ways? And then just notice. Journal what comes up and then let it be. And then the next day, come back to those 3 areas and pray about them again and say, Lord, are there new ways you want to speak to me? Where am I avoiding you? Where am I too noisy in my life? How have I formulated, that's not a word, but it is today, made a formula out of talking with you? Where have I limited my expectations of your voice? And then just journal about it for the next week or 2 weeks actually. And then if you have a spiritual director, bonus, meet with them and process with them. And you will be surprised at how much more you're going to be able to hear from God just by unpacking your patterns and your ways of relating to God around prayer. If you feel like you've been over consuming content and you just don't know how to stop or even be still, check out this video next where I talk about how to stop consuming content and actually learn to be still by listening to the Psalms and by cooperating with the Spirit in the stillness. I will see you in the next video.